began our last lesson by discussing the various reasons that together led to the outbreak of the American Civil War. What were those reasons? The first among those would be the North and the South divide. That is, the division or the conflict between the northern states on the one hand and the southern states on the other hand. The next reason that we focused on was the rampant territorial expansion towards the west of the continent. And the final reason that we came to towards the end of the discussion was the issue of slavery. Now it is the issue of slavery with which we will begin this lesson. We will focus on what this issue of slavery was and why this eventually led to the outbreak of the American Civil War. So now let us begin discussing the various causes of the American Civil War. As we just discussed that slavery was the most important cause that led to the outbreak of the American Civil War. You might not know what the real implications of slavery are, and simultaneously you might not be familiar with how this practice was being carried out before the American Civil War broke out. Now let us find out firstly what slavery means. Slavery means the condition of being a slave. Now what makes a person a slave? Suppose if one person is owned by another person almost as a commodity, that makes this person who is subject to the rule or the power of another person a slave. That is to say, slavery is the basic condition where individuals are deprived of their basic rights. This is because individuals are not treated as humans. They are not treated as individuals on their own right when they are reduced to slaves. Slaves are instead made to work without remuneration. This means that slaves are compelled to put their labor into something for which they are not even paid anything. And the labor that the slaves put in or the effort that the slaves put in go unappreciated as well. So labor is unpaid when slaves are rendering it. They have to render forced unpaid labor, and slaves are treated like property. This is a point that we just established, that slaves are not treated as human beings. Slaves have slave owners, which means that a person or a group of persons own these slaves, which makes these slaves properties. Slaves are treated like commodities. They are not given the basic human rights. Human rights as in the various civil liberties. They do not get to enjoy the natural rights that every individual is supposed to enjoy only by the virtue of being born. They are deprived of those rights. They do not have freedom, they do not have independence, and they are compelled to work without any wages, without any kind of appreciation. This practice of owning slaves and making them work for oneself is called slavery. Since slaves are not treated like human beings and instead they are treated like commodities, this almost results in a kind of a trade. Slaves are bought and sold. They are bought and sold like commodities in the market. When you go to a shop, you give money to purchase any item. Similarly, slaves were also bought and sold among the various slave owners. This is a very dehumanizing practice. It's a miserable practice. Slavery is a dehumanizing practice. Now this practice was prevalent in the ancient times, and we have seen this in the case of Egypt. Now you must be wondering how this dehumanizing institution was still prevalent in independent America. In our previous lesson, we learnt about the geographical location of the northern and the southern colonies that Britain had set up in North America. Now in the southern colonies, lands were very fertile for the production of cash crops in the likes of tobacco, sugarcane and cotton. Now when Britain set up its colonies in North America, it saw that the land was fertile enough to provide it raw materials, to provide it resources, which is why the British colonial rule encouraged the setup of new plantations of tobacco, sugarcane and cotton in the southern colonies. Now these cash crops yield the best results when they are planted in huge numbers. But with this, the British colonial rule faced a huge problem. What was that crisis? Now in order to plant all these crops in huge numbers, Britain also required laborers. Laborers were required to plant all these crops, to pursue agriculture in the southern colonies. Now the colonial settlers, or the various settlers who had come from different parts of Europe to settle in these North American colonies, they were not at all keen on pursuing agriculture in these colonial lands because they had come here with the hope of getting a better life. They did not want to, that is the colonial settlers did not want to pursue agriculture here. Now from where would Britain get labor for these plantations? Now Britain knew that if it had to bring workers or laborers from its own country, the living expenses of those laborers would be very high. The living expenses of laborers from Britain will not be as less, which in a way will be detrimental to the British colonial rule and its economy. Because Britain had set up its colonies in North America only to be able to exploit all the resources, only to be able to extort as much as possible from these lands. Which is why the British colonial rule or the British government now thought of a different plan. It now thought of bringing slaves from the distant Africa. So Britain now shipped a large number of Africans to its North American colonies. Now were these Africans now coming to the North American colonies as plantation owners? No, they were being shipped as slaves. With this came the slave trade in America. That is, these people were now forced to work as slaves in these tobacco, sugarcane and cotton plantations. And in this way, Britain was also able to exploit these vulnerable people who now were shipped to North America as slaves. Britain tortured these people and also inflicted violence on them. Now let us find out how this slave trade was being performed while Britain set up its colonies in North America and started shipping slaves from the distant continent of Africa. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, more than 10 million Africans were forcefully shipped as slaves to America, to the colonial holdings that Britain had in North America. And this was known as the Transatlantic slave trade or the Atlantic slave trade. Now, why is this called the Atlantic or Transatlantic slave trade? Because these slaves were brought in from Africa through the Atlantic Ocean, and from there they reached the 13 colonies that Britain had in North America. Now this transatlantic slave trade has gone down in history as a horrible period, because so many, that is more than 10 million Africans were forcefully shipped to North America. Do you think these Africans were very willing to shift to North America? Now they did not come to North America on their own volition. They were forcefully brought here. And in this way, Britain also ensured a triangular trade. Now let's find out how the triangular trade was performed. Britain is located in Europe, and from Africa, enslaved Africans were being sent to North America. Now those enslaved Africans were compelled to work in the tobacco, sugarcane and cotton plantations. In this way, Britain was also able to ensure that those plantations worked properly. Now what did those plantations give Britain? Britain now got raw materials from those plantations, and these raw materials from these plantations were then sent back to Britain. From there, Britain now produced finished goods, and these produced finished goods were sent to Africa. The finished goods that Britain manufactured from the raw materials that it got from the North American colonies were then sold to the Africans. So you can see here a triangular pattern of trade took place, with Europe on the one hand, that is Britain on the one hand, and Africa on the other, and the 13 colonies that North America housed were on the other hand. So now North America, or the various plantation owners, got these enslaved Africans as their slaves. With the labor that these slaves put in, they were able to produce agricultural products, and these agricultural products or raw materials were then sent to Europe. Now this was the transatlantic slave trade, and it happened between the 16th and the 19th centuries. Now what happened during this transatlantic slave trade? Have you ever seen in TV how an auction takes place? Whenever an auction takes place, a commodity is given a price, and the highest bidder gets to take that commodity. A similar kind of thing also happened in the North American colonies, mostly in the southern colonies where these enslaved Africans were sent. People used to perform slave auctions where the slaves were sold in auctions, and rich plantation owners bought these slaves for some amount. Can you imagine how miserable it might have been for those slaves? Because they were not even given the recognition and respect of being a human being. They were not regarded as humans. They were not considered as flesh and bone humans. Instead, they were considered as commodities, commodities that were shipped from one continent to the other and then bought and sold amongst rich plantation owners. Now let's talk about how this transatlantic slave trade took place. That is, how the slaves were shipped to North America. From seeing this image on your left, can you tell me what it shows you? It somehow resembles a matchbox. That is, so many matchsticks might have been crammed into a small matchbox. But it will be wrong if you consider this a matchbox, because this is the way in which slaves were shipped from Africa to the far away continent of North America. Now these enslaved Africans were beaten and they were forcefully put into these ships. And in the lower decks of these ships, they were crammed together. They did not get healthy living conditions while they were being shipped from Africa to North America. This sort of an arrangement could be seen in the lower decks of the ships, and in this way Britain could ensure that the maximum number of slaves could be shipped to North America at one go. Now this is something we have seen while we pack our bags. We try to pack our bags with as many stuffs as possible, and can you imagine, human beings were being shipped in this way. So many people died on the ships itself because of wretched living conditions. They did not get proper food, so they died out of hunger, and they were also beaten and abused and malhandled. Because of this, so many slaves chose to jump into the water because it was better than living this life of servitude. But not all slaves could escape the life of servitude this way, and they were then shipped from Africa to North America. You can see here how they were beaten, their hands and legs were tied. Now they were not given the minimum space that a person requires to live. Africa is not close to North America, because Africa is located thousands and miles away from North America, and it took quite some time for these ships to reach from Africa to North America, and in these ships they were compelled to live in these miserable conditions. But this was not the end of their misery, because when they reached the North American colonies, things got even worse for them. They were beaten, abused, and bought as products by rich plantation owners, and they were then forced to render unpaid labor in the plantations. Now, when the slaves reached North America, they were compelled to live among people who were very different from them. Very different from them in the sense of religion, in the sense of race itself, in the sense of community. These Africans were in no way similar to the people who were living in North America. They belonged to different races, which is why they had different sets of cultural beliefs, different religions, different ways of living. Now, it will be erroneous to call that they had different ways of living, because the slaves were not let to live as proper human beings in the colonies. They were treated like commodities. They did not get any kind of healthy living conditions for their sustenance. This transatlantic slave trade has been horrible in ways more than one. Now let us try to understand what was happening in North America after the slaves reached those colonies. Now this is a scenario that we just witnessed was prevalent when Britain was ruling the North American colonies. Now, when USA took birth as an independent nation, it was founded on the ideals of freedom and liberty. The people of the independent United States of America thought that this was the highest expression of ideal freedom and liberty. But this wasn't the case. This is because the century-long miserable treatment of slaves, or the century-long institution of slavery, did not come to an end with USA gaining independence. It continued well after USA got independence. Now, it is imperative on our part to find out what happened in independent USA. That is, how this practice of slavery was still prevalent even after USA got independence. Now, with this, we again come to the discussion on the difference or the split between the northern states and the southern states, geographically speaking. The southern states were mostly suited for agriculture. Agriculture of cash crops in the likes of cotton, sugarcane and tobacco. And for this, the southern states required huge amount of labor. And for the pursuit of agriculture, enslaved Africans were still being transported from Africa to the southern states of the independent United States of America. So it is mostly in the southern states of the USA that slave labor was being performed. Now, this practice of slave labor was being performed mostly in the cotton plantations. Now, why were slave labor still being used in the cotton plantations even after USA got its independence? That said, we have to remember the diverse impacts of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution necessitated that huge amounts of raw materials were required for the production of finished goods. And how could those raw materials be produced? For the production of those raw materials itself, cotton plantations, sugar plantations and tobacco plantations were required. It is for this reason that the southern states encouraged the cotton, sugarcane and tobacco plantations. And for these plantations, slaves were being shipped from Africa. So, the slave trade was mostly practiced in the southern states of the United States of America. And it will be wrong to say that the Industrial Revolution required or enforced this practice of slavery, but on the other hand, it was the Industrial Revolution that augmented the need for slaves. Because after the Industrial Revolution, more and more amounts of raw materials were required, and this also intensified the requirement for slaves. Now, you must have understood how the Industrial Revolution, indirectly though, had intensified or strengthened this practice of slavery, this practice of using slave labor. because this industrial revolution had increased the demand for cotton. And with the increase for the demand for various raw materials came in the need for getting more slaves. Now, what was happening in the northern states? The southern states heavily relied on slave labor. Was it the same thing in the northern states of the USA as well? Let us find that out. The northern states, on the other hand, were developing very much during the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, industrial centers were being set up and trade was being performed in the northern states. The northern states did not rely on agriculture. Instead, they were the producers of finished goods. And few people in the northern states who worked in small farms and not plantations were also given proper wages, which is why the northern states saw paid laborers. The northern states did not rely on unpaid labor from the slaves. The factories and small farms in the northern states required or relied on paid laborers. So the thing was very different between the northern and the southern states. You must be understanding how these were the roots that led to the outbreak of the American Civil War or led to the split between the northern and the southern states. Now, the northern states also realized that the practice of slavery itself was dehumanizing. It was a dehumanizing institution that reduced human beings to commodities. Now, exposure to liberal ideas gave the people in the northern states this knowledge that slavery was an ill treatment, it was an ill practice, which is why they wanted to abolish slavery. There was no kind of slavery practiced in the northern states. The laborers were well paid for the work they had to do. Now, this shows you the beginning of the split between the northern and the southern states, and it was the issue of slavery that was at the center of it all. Following this split between the northern and the southern states, now emerged a new movement. What this new movement was and what shape it took, we will come to later. But for now, let us understand that between 1777 and 1804, this movement came into being. This movement wanted to ban or abolish the practice of slavery altogether. And it were the northern states of USA that abolished slavery completely. The northern states did not rely on unpaid labor from the slaves, and this we have discussed a while ago. So, they completely abolished slavery. The northern states now proclaimed themselves as the free states, that is, free from the bondage of slavery. While on the other hand, the southern states had established their economy in such a way that they relied heavily on the unpaid labor that the slaves rendered, which is why the southern states were in no way intending to abolish slavery. They profited a lot from this slavery, from this practice of slavery. So it was for their own good that they did not support this abolition of slavery. So the southern states opposed the abolition of slavery, and they now came to be known as the slave states. On the one hand, we have the free states, that is, the northern states who abolished slavery, and on the other hand, that is, on the contrary side, we have the slave states, that is, the various southern states that were in no way intending to abolish slavery. This is the beginning of the conflict, the beginning of dissent between the northern and the southern states, and it was the issue of slavery that was at the heart of everything. Before proceeding with our lesson and understanding how the split between the northern and the southern states eventually led to the outbreak of the American Civil War, let me ask you a question. Mention whether the following statement is true or false. The northern states became free states. Do you think this statement is true or is it false? Yes, you are right. This statement is true. the northern states became the free states because they abolished slavery, and on the other hand the southern states came to be known as the slave states because they were propagating, or they wanted to strengthen, this practice of slavery. Now let us come to a very important discussion on territorial expansion. Now territorial expansion happened after America got its independence from British colonial rule. Initially we learnt that Britain had set up 13 colonies in North America, which after America gaining independence became the 13 independent states. But was the country, that is the United States of America, have only 13 states itself? Let us find out how territorial expansion now happened towards the west and what were the obvious repercussions of this territorial expansion. With the point we just discussed right now, you must be wondering why territorial expansion took place. That is, what was the need for territorial expansion? It was population increase. Now after the Industrial Revolution, that is after industrial centers started growing, huge number of settlers from Europe as in from Britain, Ireland and Germany, now started coming to North America, now started settling in the United States of America. Now they were coming to the northern states of the United States of America. Why is it so? Because we learned that during and after the Industrial Revolution, it were the northern states that emerged as very powerful centers that slowly started developing into industrial centers, which is why so many people were now propelled by the American dream and they started coming to the northern states. So it were the northern states where, due to the industries and various important offices, that settlers from Britain, Ireland and Germany started coming in. So many people coming in, how can USA have only 13 states and still accommodate all these new settlers? This is a big question, because this map roughly shows you the northern states of the United States of America. Now where did so many new settlers fit in? People were coming in huge numbers and it was difficult for the nation to accommodate and to let so many people live in this new country. Now what was USA doing? That is, how did it expand its territories? This brings us to a discussion on the territorial expansion that US undertook after the Industrial Revolution. So in order to accommodate so many new settlers, the Americans now started purchasing, winning, annexing and claiming various territories. Now is it really easy for the Americans to do so? Now previously in this continent lived the various indigenous people, the various indigenous tribes. Along with that, various European powers in the likes of France and Spain also had their colonies in North America. Now when so many people started coming in from Europe, right after America got its independence and the Industrial Revolution had positive impact on the northern states, the Americans had to do something. So they started purchasing new territories. And among this, the most popular territory that was purchased from France, that is purchased from France in the year 1803, was the area called Louisiana. This was a territory that was formerly under French control, that is French colonial control, and now the Americans bought this territory or purchased this territory from France in the year 1803. But the Americans weren't restricted to only purchasing territories. They also went into wars and started bringing new territories under their control. Now you must be knowing Texas as the place of cowboys, but initially it belonged to Mexico. Now USA went to war with Mexico in 1845 and it annexed the territory of Texas from Mexico. So Texas also came under the control of USA. Along with that, that is along with purchasing new lands or annexing new lands, The Americans now simply went to new territories, settled there and claimed it their own. The American government was also supporting this process because in this way the territories were also expanding. And one territory or one area that was brought under the control of the Americans in this process was the Oregon country. Now this Oregon country was previously under the rule of Britain. After Britain was defeated and forced to retreat, it saw that it had no power to still keep this Oregon country under its control. So Britain gave up this territory in the year 1846 and now Oregon country also came under the control of USA. In this way, lands under the control of USA started increasing. The territory of Louisiana was bought from the French. It was during the rule of Napoleon that the Americans bought Louisiana, because we have learned that after the French Revolution, France was severely impacted economically. So Napoleon chose to sell off this territory of Louisiana and it came under the control of the Americans. Simultaneously, the Americans also annexed the territory of Texas after waging a war with Mexico. Americans also brought under their control Oregon country. And in this way, the United States of America was territorially expanding towards the west. That is, it was bringing new territories that previously lied westwards to it under its control. In this way, territorial expansion happened after America gained its independence. Now, this territorial expansion was also a hotbed of contention, and let us find out how this territorial expansion also resulted in conflict and what shape this conflict took. With this territorial expansion towards the west, the new areas that were brought under the control of the USA became their territories. Now, a territory is very different from a state. A territory is simply an area that is kept under the control of the country. On the other hand, a state is an independent and an autonomous political unit. And more so in the case of the federal government that was in place in the United States of America, states were very important. So when these various territories were purchased or annexed or brought under the control, USA realized that these territories had to be declared or given the shape of formal states. So these newly settled territories were now incorporated as new states of USA. Now it did not happen overnight. That is, immediately after annexing or buying those territories, they were not given the formal status of states. It happened over time. This was a process that took some time, and eventually the number of states under the United States of America started increasing. So after this territorial expansion took place and these territories were being given formal shape and structure of states by the United States of America, conflict arose. Why was there conflict over the states? One of our previous lessons we learnt how the Senate was formed by equal representatives from all the states. Now each state got to send 2 representatives to the Senate. So irrespective of the size or population of the states, they were able to send only 2 representatives to the Senate. Now while these territories were being incorporated as states under this one nation, conflict broke out between the northerners on the one hand and the southerners on the one hand. Now what was the reason behind this conflict? Previously we learnt that the issue of slavery split the northern states and the southern states. The northern states on the one hand decided to abolish slavery completely, which is why they called them the free states, and the southern states on the other hand decided to keep in place or rely upon slavery, which is why they came to be known as the slave states. Now when these new states were being incorporated, the southerners wanted all these new states to be slave states, and on the other hand the northerners or the various northern states wanted these new states to be free states. Now this graphical illustration shows you how the northerners and the southerners were fighting over the states, that is whether these new states would become free states or slave states. and from this arose conflicts. The northerners and the southerners were previously divided on the grounds of the issue of slavery, and now they are being divided further on the grounds of territorial expansion, that is whether the new states will become free states or slave states. Now this is one of the biggest reason why the northerners and the southerners completely chose to separate from each other. Let us find out what was happening because of this issue between the northern states and the southern states. With this, we come to an end of our discussion on two major reasons why the American Civil War broke out. We learnt what the issue of slavery was and how this practice of slavery was being performed in America, and how this practice of slavery was prevalent in the southern states of America, mostly in the cotton plantations. We also learned about the transatlantic slave trade, through which enslaved Africans were shipped from Africa to the distant North America. Now the northern states and the southern states of the USA were divided on the grounds of slavery. The northern states on the one hand abolished slavery, and the southern states on the other hand relied upon slavery. They in no way had the intention of abolishing slavery. After territorial expansion took place following the impact of the Industrial Revolution, the northern states and the southern states were also embroiled in conflict as to whether the new states that were being incorporated would become free states or slave states. It is this discussion that we will be continuing further in our subsequent lesson. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.